When human civilization embraced technology to start on the path where we are today, one of the most fundamental contributing factors was the invention of agriculture that more or less 10,000 years ago switched our ability to build and control and use and reuse calories in a given area of land and put us on a trajectory that we are still following of exponential growth, both of population as well as the calories that are needed to support that population. My name is David Orban, and this is the What is the Question? The Searching for the Question podcast. And my co-host is Hannes Sjöblad. Welcome, Hannes.
Hi, David. It's wonderful to be with you today.
We are going to talk about food and water, and what technology can do in order to support, but even let thrive populations of 8, 9, maybe 10 billion people on the planet and beyond. How can technology help not only sustain, but provide incredibly nutritious, healthy, and exciting food experiences to all of those people?
I think it's fantastic, David. There are so many food podcasts out there, but this one will be a little bit different because we will not be talking about how to cook lovely food or different recipes and how things taste, but we will be focusing on the network society and the technology dimensions of food. The great thing with food, and I love to have conversations on food, and I do quite a few talks on food tech, is that everyone has a very deeply emotional relationship to food. And so it's nice for once to speak of technology that everyone can have a strong view on and have can contribute to the conversation on with their fundamentally held views. So if we start with that flying question, what does the food tech industry mean to you in relation to the network society?
Our fundamental thesis is that technology at any given point in history actually gives rise to a certain type of society that in turn adopts the political structure that this society expresses. So with regards to food and water, the question is, what is the current level of technology and what changes the coming technologies are going to allow? A consequence that is again part of our fundamental thesis of the current wave of technologies is that these will lead not only to address our challenges in a manner that will be positive for humanity as a whole, but it will lead to decentralization rather than centralized and hierarchical solutions that we have seen in the past. The current and coming wave of technologies will allow a more robust, a more sustainable, and more decentralized organization to emerge. So, just very quickly, maybe a couple of examples of what I believe is going to be unavoidably part of the food equation in the future is hydroponics and aeroponics. On one hand, the ability to grow food with vastly fewer resources in terms of soil and energy and water, and the availability of cultivated meat, synthetic meat, 3D printed meat, whatever you want to call it. So these are a couple of examples that we can look at in a little more detail, and I'm sure you also have examples that you want to cover.
I have a lot, and I think that the ones you mention are indeed interesting transformative technologies, although if we compare them in scale to our current food production systems, it's of course diminutive still. We are still very much an agricultural based society. Yes, we have factory farms for animals, etc., but the entire human food supply system is ultimately based on farms and fields. But it will be interesting to explore a few dimensions of it. But I would love to bring up my one of my favorite examples in the story of agriculture, David. And I would like to ask you, what, in your eyes, is the most important invention that was made in the 20th century?
I believe it is certainly synthetic fertilizers that allowed us to put on an industrial scale our ability to grow calories from vegetable origins in farming, decoupling it from bird shit, which was originally the source of the
So,
fertilizers.
if I can outline the case, because I think it's a beautiful case of technology history. It's the German chemist Haber who discovered a process for extracting nitrogen from the air. And up to the beginning of the 20th century, nitrogen for synthetic fertilizer was exactly as you say, something that was dug out of the ground, typically from islands where there was millennia of bird leftovers. And Chile was the biggest exporter of mined nitrogen 100 some years ago. However, with the invention of the Haber-Bosch process, so Franz Haber was the inventor who, through pressure and heat, managed to extract ammonia out of the air, and then the industrialist Bosch, who made it into an enormous industrial process and allowed us to produce these enormous amounts of artificial fertilizer. Yes, that, in my view, is also without doubt the biggest technological invention of the 20th century, because ultimately, if that process had not been invented, most likely there would be about 3 billion fewer people alive on the planet right now. And as I love to point out when I stand in front of an audience, is that, hey guys, did you know that approximately 80 to 90% of all the nitrogen molecules that constitute your bodies have gone through the Haber-Bosch process? So we would physically not exist in the forms we are if it wasn't for this very interesting breakthrough. And we will come back to this example a little bit later in our conversation, because the idea of extracting a wonderful resource from air is quite mind-blowing, and it must have been that to the people who were stuck with the idea that fertilizer was something that you would dig out of the ground.
Technology makes resources that used to be scarce abundant. And of course, a lot of people like to point out that technology also creates new problems. One of the challenges today is to improve or transform the process of creating artificial fertilizers so that it doesn't depend on fossil fuels source energy anymore. And that as a consequence, the whole process can be such that it doesn't contribute to CO2 emissions in the atmosphere. And once we are able to do that, which is going to require the use of solar energy and innovative industrial processes, I think it will be very, very interesting, because it will come simultaneously with other innovations as well. And decarbonizing our food production process, the industrial part of the food production process, is going to be quite fundamental.
It's interesting when you bring up the term decarbonization. If we look at, for example, the planetary status reports from Stockholm Resilience Center and other research institutes, yes, we are having increasingly higher amounts of carbon dioxide in the air, but in fact, the nitrogen cycle on the planet is in a lot worse shape than the carbon dioxide cycle. And the fact that the coral reefs are dying and that we have ocean floors that are dying is very much a factor of the nitrogen cycle being absolutely overwhelmed with the application of industrial farming. So yes, we also need to break that part. This is an unhealthy state of affairs that we have, that we're over fertilizing so many fields in order to feed the global population.
Yeah, eutrophication of water supplies, leading to algae blooms of all kinds, is one of the reasons for this change, and optimizing our control of how fertilizer is applied and used by the plants is going to be not only necessary in order to avoid the runoffs that are now creating this damage. But actually, the positive outcome is going to be that we are going to be able to apply much more precise quantities when they are needed, where they are needed, rather than just blanket covering everything like we are doing today. Similarly to how applying pesticides acritically, just blanketing everything is not the most efficient way to do. And we are learning through precision agriculture techniques what can be done better.
Yes. So if we then come to the present day, yes, we have a planet that is somewhat under pressure from our current food production systems. We have the runoff. We also have the, for example, clearing of rainforests is a classic factor often brought up by environmentalists, that we're clearing these fields in order to have beef cows walking around there making hamburgers for us. We also know for a fact that our current food production systems are not efficient, in the sense that there are enormous amounts of food that are discarded for various reasons in all the different stages of the production process. So some stuff never leaves the fields, some never end up in the stores, some never come to people's homes, and a lot of food that end up in people's homes are anyway rejected and not eaten. So potentially with smarter logistics, better resource management system using artificial or big data driven systems, we can optimize the resource distribution of food on our planet and reduce food waste. And I think that in itself would be an enormous win made within the current paradigms of the system. And then if we on top of that add these novel technologies that I would love to explore with you now, David, the aquaponics, the micro-managed farming, where you control exactly how much nutrient and light that goes into every plant. This, of course, was not possible before, but with the availability of very cheap sensors and control systems, we can now run very efficient farming systems in any location, and we don't even need to have fields anymore. We can put them in urban areas, or we can put them underground. And that is also a fascinating development in terms of looking at the network society effect, that we want to democratize the access of food production resources.
The evolution of how we produce and consume food in our society is absolutely fascinating. A few hundred years ago, the likelihood that you were born a farmer and your father would be a farmer and your children would be farmers was practically 100%. But little by little, with increasing urbanization and then industrialization, the number of people who are dedicated to farming decreased. And today, depending on where you look, more or less 2-3% in the high income countries of the population uh, creates the calories that are able to feed 100% of the population. Uh, with the further changes that we mentioned, this will increase still. Robotic farming is now being tested in China and elsewhere, where the number of people that need to look after a given area of field growing food is even further decreased. But in urban environments, urban farming, urban gardening, indoor farming even is increasing as well. So these are going to create very interesting dynamics where people who have never been farmers for generations are going to be able, with some kind of trepidation, but also excitement, to start growing their own food. And this can be extremely beneficial. Of course, as you pointed out, the percentage of food and calories that people in urban environments are going to grow for themselves is going to be relatively small with respect of the total that they need, initially at least. But what matters is the ability and the learning process, which will introduce them to this possibility. And this will progressively increase in time until the point where it will create a support infrastructure that is much more resilient. It is much more capable of satisfying the needs and do them capable of withstanding crises of various types than not before.
Excellent point. And in this setting, I would also, I mean, we are both technologists, David, and we are always fascinated by the applications of technology. But I also want to discuss with you an interesting social trend that is clear in a lot of developing economies, and that is that large groups of young people are going for vegetarian or even vegan diets. At least in Sweden, where I live, it's a very powerful trend, and we have I don't have the exact numbers, but there are new vegetarian restaurants all over the place. It's becoming very much the norm to focus on plant-based foods. And as a food entrepreneur myself, I always said that when we talk about food, we must evaluate food from three dimensions. And the three dimensions, in my view, are, first of all, it's the taste and the aesthetic and the culinary experience of food, which is important. The second dimension is the nutritional value of food, what difference it actually makes after it has passed my taste buds and enters my system. And the third dimension is what effect did the production of this particular foodstuff have on the planet and the planetary system. And well, the challenge with vegetarian foods has often been that they have not lived up to the taste experience of people who have perhaps grown up with thinking that meat is a component of every meal. However, when you evaluate vegetarian food from the perspective of nutrition effect on the body, as well as the effect on the planetary food production systems, they really win out in the long run in terms of health for people and planet. So maybe beyond technology, there is also these quite powerful social dimensions which we can apply in order to change the habits and have a better functioning food systems. What's your take? I believe you are a meat eater, David.
I'm an omnivore. I have adopted a vegan behavior for 8 months a few years ago, and for me it was wonderful, a lot of fun to dedicate time to prepare a nutritious and exciting meal. And I also lost a lot of weight, which was good because I am definitely overweight. So it was a positive outcome. And I snapped out of it, unfortunately. On one hand, because my wife really didn't like that I wouldn't eat what everybody else in the family ate, and she likes to cook, and so that was an issue. But I was visiting Japan, and we had reception dinners with incredible sushi prepared, and I didn't feel not being able to taste that at the time. But I aspire to go back, if not on a completely plant-based diet, at least radically reduce meat, or ideally balance it in a manner that reduces animal suffering in my diet. Because you are right, the social and the moral component in how we feed ourselves is something that matters to more and more people, and luckily we can afford to do that. Just as during Roman times, there may have been people who felt slavery was immoral, but they didn't see an alternative. But today we have been able to make slavery illegal because it has been universally recognized that it is possible and desirable to build societies without. I firmly believe that it will be something very similar that is going to happen in our society around industrial animal farming, and the fact that we recognize that a lot of the animals that we eat are sentient to high degrees, and it is really a tragedy that we are accustomed to slaughtering them and eating them.
Yeah, I second your view there. I am myself an omnivore by habit and upbringing, but have flirted many times with veganism, inspired by not least Peter Singer's, the philosopher and animal rights ethicist, who argues. I mean, there are many dimensions, of course, to choosing what you eat, but to reduce the intake of animal foods seems like a moral, valid position to take, both for one's own system, for the benefit of the animals specifically, and thirdly, for the resource use of the entire ecosystem. So yes, vegetarian veganism is certainly here to stay, and I believe that it's just going to further take ground, and not unlikely. It's difficult to tell about the time, of course, but we will perhaps make that into a norm, and that ultimately eating meat will be a little bit like smoking these days. That it's something that people look a little bit over to the side if you do. I wanted in that setting, though, to bring up one of my pet projects, which is a few years back I was involved in setting up a company doing insect farming. So we were growing crickets in shipping containers and creating portable cricket farms. And the deeper I got involved into that industry, the more fascinated I was. Unfortunately, in the European Union, the legislation doesn't allow us to freely produce and sell insect-based foods. Some countries, like Finland and the Netherlands and a couple of others, have made exceptions in the national legal system, allowing insect farmers to sell crickets and mealworms and other similar products openly on the market, and allowing consumers to make their own decisions. And it's fascinating what you actually can achieve by growing crickets instead of, for example, growing chickens, because the amount of protein biomass that you can produce in terms of crickets in relation to traditional poultry or pork farming is higher by a factor of 10 to 100. When you look at the resource use, it needs less water, it needs less energy, it needs less input. And this is because a number of factors, but one of them being that insects, they breed very fast, they have very short generation cycles, and they multiply very, very fast. Second dimension is that they also can eat pretty much anything, whereas beef cows, for example, are very picky with the diet, and they need a very specific diet in order to grow. The insects can eat any kind of food side stream or even gardening leftovers. And thirdly, the fact that these animals are not, they are metabolically cold-blooded. So unlike a cow or a chicken that waste a lot of the food that goes into their mouths and beaks just for making warming up their cells. The insects, they don't have this problem. So they can use all the energy that goes into their little mouths to grow and to reproduce. And if we are going to continue eating meat and have animal-based proteins, I think that insect farming is really a business for the future with marvelous potential. And I encourage any listeners to try insect-based foods because they can be just as delicious as any other traditional food. You can use insects. Visually, one of my favorite dishes was to fry crickets with cinnamon and sugar and have it on top of vanilla ice cream. But you can also just grind them and put them into, for example, bread, which then tastes just like normal bread. It's just with the benefit that you actually have the ham and cheese is sort of nutritionally already included in the bread. So you don't need to put that ham and cheese on top of it because you still get a broader nutritional spectrum with a higher protein content with this insect fortified bread. Have you
If
tried insects,
somebody,
David?
yeah, if somebody wants to have an interesting excuse to come and visit Italy, they have thousands or millions of reasons, of course. But an additional reason can be to visit the city of Bergamo, where in the Museum of Natural History, the director, whom I know, organizes evenings of entomophagy. Evenings of eating insect-based food, and it is funny because Italian regulations keep insects in a gray area. So every time he just sends the communication to the health organization overseeing this, and they don't know what to respond, so they don't respond, and then he goes ahead and organizes these fascinating dinners. And I had definitely fun trying it. I am not alone. The United Nations actually, in its analysis of humanity's food sources and food supply, recently made a recommendation that just as it is already the case in Asia and in some other places, the rest of the world also should increase, possibly quite a large amount, the source of calories coming from insects in its production and intake. Um, and you mentioned the container-based production of insects. So this is also fascinating in terms of how it can be readily productized as soon as the regulatory environment allows it. And in one of our future episodes is actually going to talk about reg tech, how understanding the necessity of changing policies and regulations can help beneficial technologies accelerate and be adopted much more rapidly than otherwise could happen. So let's talk about this a little bit more. Insect sourced protein is here already available. Another protein source that is increasing rapidly in availability and decreasing in cost is cultivated meat. Cultivated meat is the ability to grow animal protein, animal cells without the animal in nutritious suspensions in vats, practically. And the sight of something like that is certainly unpalatable. But after the whole process, it is possible to create hamburger patties or any other kind of unstructured meat product. You cannot create a steak as of today. And it used to be that this process was very, very expensive, but the cost is decreasing very rapidly. And the amount of energy, water, soil that is needed in order to obtain the classical hamburger patty is reduced by 90% each or more. And of course, it is done with complete elimination of animal suffering. Um, so, what one of once again, the Netherlands is one of the leading places where this is taking place. I had the chance of meeting the university professor and now CEO of one of these companies recently, and he expects within the next 3-4 years actually a crossover where the cost per kilogram or pound of cultivated meat is going to be less than the cost of regular slaughtered meat, and then never be more expensive again. So year after year, it will be ever more available, ever more inexpensive, and I really expect that not in 5 years, but within the next decades.
That is fascinating. The idea of lab grown meat, I have dabbled myself, some in the field. Being a biohacker myself, I have worked together with several friends working to prepare facilities and see if we can grow our own foods and what is needed. And there are some complications, unfortunately, in relation to producing mammalian cells, which is, for example, beef muscle cells in large scale conditions. So if we pick the topic apart a little bit,
The opportunity to explore not only what it means from an entrepreneurial point of view, not only what it means from a culinary point of view, but also to understand the social implications of this industry is really fascinating. If cultivated meat takes off, we will have an interesting conundrum. Today, if you compare the population of, I don't know, zebra against cows, the first are much less successful than the second because zebra cannot be domesticated, and cows can, and they have been very, very successful in keeping up their large numbers. When on one hand plant-based diets and on the other hand cultivated meat will represent a large part of humanity's food source, the cow population will radically decline, and it will be the same with chickens and pigs and sheep. So I'm not saying that that is the most important consideration, but it will be an interesting consequence from billions of individuals. It will go back maybe to millions, and I don't know. Is it going to be the case that cows will be running the danger of becoming extinct in the future? We will have to think about that as well.
It's a fascinating thought experiment, and I think there is an elegant analogy, as both you and I are fond of making, with history, and that is the decline in the number of horses with the introduction of motorized vehicles. So there was a big drop in the number of horses, which were everywhere in society in the first half of the 20th century. We've recently seen a little comeback, but that is horses for a very different uses. So it's more of a hobby and a leisure activity. But I wanted to get a little bit into the meat farming thing, because to go straight to the point, the challenge with growing mammalian cells in vitro is simply that when you grow the meat cells in the shape of a cow, they come with a immune system. So the cow has an immune system that fights off bacteria or infections or whatever. When you grow these meat cells, which are unfortunately very susceptible to all kinds of diseases and infections, you need to have an extremely controlled environment so that not a single bacteria or virus can get into to the growing vat. Because if that happens very quickly, they will contaminate the meat cells. And those conditions are possible to maintain in relatively small controlled lab settings. But if we are looking at the food production system at the scale of our current factory farming system, where we are speaking in terms of hundreds of billions of chickens and sheep and cow that mankind consumes every year, it will be extremely challenging, because right now, if you grow meat in a vat, you will need to bombard it with, not just keep it extremely sterile, but also bombard it with growth medium, as well as like penicillin and antibiotics of all different kinds. And that makes it also not ideal from an environment point of view, and it also makes it expensive to produce. So my twist on the grown meat project is that, unfortunately, we have this image, and the meat growing project have put this image quite powerfully in our heads, that the hamburger is the goal. And I think the Americans are to blame for this, because for them the hamburger is this iconic piece of food. So, and actually making a steak or a hamburger is probably the most challenging thing you can attempt to do if you're going to lab grow meat. And there are many other much lower hanging fruits that we should likely aim for instead of the holy grail of the hamburger. For example, we have the potential to grow muscle meat, where you don't need it has a much more slimy and therefore a very different texture than you would ask from a beef or a hamburger, because lab grown meat is pretty much slime that you then have to process to give it some kind of structure. What instead we can do today at scale is that we can grow plant-based proteins in lab conditions, or we can use yeast cells to produce foodstuffs that we need. There are some wonderful examples from the different indie bio accelerator projects. For example, there is a company that is called Perfect Day, and they use yeast cells to produce cow's milk. And I think that is a brilliant hack, where you take genes from a mammal and you implant them into yeast cells. The benefit with yeast cells is that they can live independently. You don't need to give them very specific hormones to grow that you need to do with the muscle cells. And also you don't need by far the same amount of penicillin and other protections, because these things have an immune system of their own to deal with infection and bacteria. So we have also Clara Foods that do, for example, egg white proteins, also based on synthetic biology processes. So I think that those type of products that are not directly based on animal muscle cells will be quicker and faster and have a bigger impact on the food market than ultimately the lab grown meat.
One of the consequences of all of these technologies is that rather than current agricultural techniques whose output is proportional to the area available, each of these we can organize each of these approaches so that its output is actually proportional to the volume that we can control, and this is very important because we have much more volume available on the planet than surface. We can go down, we can go up, we can build skyscrapers, or we can build deep caverns, and as a consequence, contrary to what was the case in the 60s, when the report of the Club of Rome predicted widespread famine by the 80s, 20 years later, which were prevented by the so-called Green Revolution, the industrialization of our food process. But still, it is an open question how long we are going to be able to produce the calories needed by everybody. This transformation of food production going into 3D is going to create almost unbounded possibilities, because the ultimate source of calories is the sun, is the energy that we take from the sun, and going solar is going to enable us to take much more energy per capita than we have today, together with the other components, carbon and nitrogen, and everything that plants put together by themselves, and that we will put together in these three-dimensional food production and environments. So, from that point of view, I am very optimistic that we will be able to face the challenges of giving high quality, nutritious, exciting food to the 8, 9, 10 billion people that will be on the planet.
True, and perhaps we should end on that optimistic note with what I find a highly inspirational example. Earlier in this conversation, we talked about the Haber-Bosch process and the, at the time, quite mind-blowing idea of producing synthetic fertilizer out of the air. However, today we see companies working with synthetic biology and genetically modified organisms, simply allowing them to absorb electricity and energy and carbon dioxide from the air in order to produce food for humans. There is, for example, the company Solar Foods in Finland who are developing this particular process, ultimately working to make food from air. And it's fascinating the way it's done, because yes, as you described, David, it means a complete decoupling of this age-old concept that in order to produce food, we need to have fields. Just like in the old days, if you wanted to have fertilizer, you have to dig it out of the ground. But if we can have this system with bioreactors that we feed with solar energy, and the only thing they need to extract from the world around them is carbon dioxide, then we truly achieve this decoupling, that we can produce food, as you say, high in skyscrapers in the middle of the desert where there is plenty of air and plenty of sunshine, or why not in deep mines underground, so that we can make these farm fields that are now covering so much of the world back into something else, and we can let the wild animals roam free, or we can make them into parking lots or whatever we fancy. But ultimately, we will not need to have all these fields in order to produce food for ourselves.
Hopefully, not farming, parking lots, but yes.
I like fields better than parking lots, but
when we let nature take over, actually, it very rapidly recovers. It is amazing that Chernobyl these days is extremely rich in its wild natural environment. And one of the reasons is because humans abandoned it. Also, Europe's cover of forests increased very importantly, between 10 and 15% in the past 30, 40 years. Because of increased urbanization, changing agricultural processes. So something like that could happen very well in the Amazon region as well, with the rich natural ecosystem recovering once the pressure we put on it diminishes. And it has the ability to recover even from very high stress, high pressure situations. So I'm looking forward to this transformation that we described, and then enjoy the surface of the planet that can give rise to all kinds of experiences, and it is not used as the industrial support system as it is today. We can send heavy industries out in space, food production in skyscrapers or in mines, and enjoy the surface of the planet as a natural paradise to be experienced and to interact with.
It does sound marvelous, yes. I mean, that we know as a fact is not an endless resource. The surface area of our planet is indeed a fixed amount of land. There was, before we round off, there was a single final concept I wanted to discuss with you, David, and that is that we are seeing with the development of food delivery services, which is a fast-growing business, Uber Eats and many others across a number of large economies. We are seeing the creation of apartments that do no longer have kitchens. And I think I would love to have your network society reflection on this system, because what if we are seeing the end of the kitchen? I mean, back in the days, every farming house, the family would cook their own food. But maybe we are also seeing a trend of centralization of food delivery, and people really just have their homes to sleep in, and they can order whatever they want to eat now with the network society food distribution system built up. What is your take on this?
So different scales require different types of logistics, different skills, different support infrastructures. Food delivery is never going to be, I think, something that happens in a transcontinental scale. If you want to eat your dinner within the next hour, right? While we do transport grain from one continent to the other. So I'd rather see a city enriching itself with 100 different options of what dinner to order in a given day, in terms of ethnic backgrounds, if in terms of styles of preparation, and in many other ways. We do love to think about the way our mothers cooked, and we think about it in a very nostalgic manner. But cooking every day is a chore, and freeing up human potential to do other things or cook if you choose to do so. Actually, there are services that deliver you not ready-made meals, but meals ready to be cooked, but prepared in a manner that even somebody who is not extremely skilled is going to be able to prepare it. These are all options that enrich our choices, give us new degrees of freedom in order to experiment, experience, and express our potential. So I see it as very positive. Also, the quality and our expectations of what we can expect from food and nutrition is going to be enhanced by the competition of different services. In terms of how we organize our lives, how the traditional concept of our dwelling changes, yes, it is going to be absolutely fascinating. If you think about it, many kitchens, the vast majority of the kitchens still in a modern urban environment uses gas to cook. uh, Electricity is increasing, but still laying down the gas pipes is something that every apartment needs and every building receives. So if we think about the possibility of moving away from individual cooking, which would be on gas, this will also free up the way that we design, we build, and we experience living conditions. And the flexibility that this gives is something that we should cherish. Once again, only if regulators wake up to the possibilities. I was heartbroken just a few months ago when once again the San Francisco regulators rejected the possibility of creating smaller housing units that basically keep San Francisco in the past, and they distort the housing market. One of the big reasons for how expensive it is to live in San Francisco, inaffordable for most, is because of this regulatory shackle that is on the market that cannot express itself. So I am all for experimentation in the ways we live, in the food we eat, and in the next few episodes of our podcast, we will be exploring more of this. I thank you, Hannes, for today's conversation. Very interesting and stimulating, and as always. And I'm looking forward to the episodes that we'll be recording next.
Thank you so much, David. It's always a pleasure.